Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, March 13th, 2025. Big news about the Ukrainian ceasefire. We're going to talk about that in just a few seconds. But first, don't forget we do have the vid chat tomorrow afternoon. That will be at 2 p.m. U.S. Central Time. That means get your questions or comments posted in the comments area no later than 10 o'clock U.S. Central Time tonight. And remember, there's a limit of one post per member, okay? And try to keep things relatively short. We're still under that new format, trying to keep things under about 3 hours. So, with that, no further ado, let's get into the Ukrainian ceasefire. There's a relatively, for the Associated Press, there's a relatively decent article that they have outlining all the ifs, ands, and buts about this proposed ceasefire. I want to attempt to put things into a slightly broader context, but I do want to read some paragraphs from this article because I think they're quite important by way of understanding the wider backdrop of what's going on. So beginning towards the top of this article, the article's titled, Press to Accept a Ceasefire in the Ukraine. Putin seems likely to seek his own conditions. Quote, Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly ruled out a temporary break in hostilities, saying it would only benefit the Ukraine and its Western allies by letting them replenish their arsenals. He has insisted Moscow wants a comprehensive agreement that would ensure a lasting settlement. The Kremlin responded cautiously to the news of the Ukraine accepting the U.S. proposed truce during Tuesday's talks in Saudi Arabia, stating that it needs to know details of the discussions before expressing its view. The careful approach reflects Putin's awareness of the risk that a blunt rejection of the offer could upset tentative efforts to renormalize U.S.-Russia ties. The Ukraine, skipping a couple paragraphs here, the Ukraine has sought to retake the initiative with a surprise foray into Russia's Kursk region that began in August, seeking to distract Moscow's forces from their offensive in the eastern Ukraine and making gains that would potentially be exchanged for Russian-occupied areas in peace talks. The incursion, however, has diverted Ukrainian sources from defending the Donetsk region in the east, and it failed to stem Russian advances there. Now Ukrainian forces are on the verge of losing their last remaining bridgehead in Kursk under the brunt of a swift Russian counteroffensive. Moscow also ravaged Ukrainian energy infrastructure with waves of missiles and drones, destroying much of its power-generating capacity. Putin has repeatedly said a temporary halt to hostilities at a time when Russian forces firmly hold the initiative would only allow exhausted Ukrainian troops to a break to rest and reform and rearm. Quote, as for the settlement of the situation, I would like to emphasize that it shouldn't be aimed at a brief truce, some sort of break for regrouping troops and rearmament in order to continue the conflict, but a long-term peace. And, folks, I have to stop here and interrupt my citation of paragraphs from this article because we have never really been completely told the truth by the Western propaganda media of just how bad the Ukrainian military situation has been, and we certainly have never been told the complete truth about the elements of what the Russians are calling Nazism. This is the old Stefan Bandera units in the Ukrainian military and some of the things that they were doing. But the narrative began to break with that Ukrainian offensive into the Kursk region because that was Zelensky's, if I can put it this way, that was Zelensky's do-or-die moment. And that offensive, as if you've been following the news, has collapsed. And it's not only collapsed, but it has resulted in surrounding of those Ukrainian troops and basically a complete collapse of the Ukrainian forces in that pocket. So you're looking at a Ukrainian military that is in tatters. There is no way, and I am going to be very blunt and share my own personal assessment here. There is no way that any amount of Western aid or European aid or American aid is going to change the military situation on the ground and in the air for the Ukraine, short of an all-out war with Russia. No way. And that's the reality of the situation. In other words, what I'm saying is all the high cards are in Mr. Putin's hand, not Mr. Trump's. Now, with that said, there are some things lurking in the background that we'll get to in a minute. Mr. Putin is absolutely exercising due caution and diplomacy, in my opinion, by not just leaping to the negotiation table in response to this American offer of a ceasefire. He wants to know the exact terms. And in the past, ceasefires have been used to rearm and re-equip the Ukrainian military and keep the conflict going. And there are forces in the West that want to keep that vast money laundering operation going, as we know. So let's get back to the article. Quote, Putin's key goals remain what he declared when he launched the full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022. The Ukraine renounced joining NATO, sharply cut its army, and protect Russian language and culture to keep the country in Moscow's orbit. On top of that, he now wants Kiev to withdraw its forces from the 4 regions Moscow has seized but doesn't fully control. That will change. That will change. There's going to be no result to this other than full Russian control of those areas. Russian officials have also said that any prospective peace deal should involve unfreezing Russian assets in the West and lifting other American and European Union sanctions. The Trump administration has put a potential sanctions relief on the table. Along with that, Putin has repeatedly emphasized the need to remove the root causes of the crisis, a reference to the Kremlin's demand to roll back a NATO military buildup near Russian borders it describes as a major threat to its security. And again, I view that as entirely reasonable. If, after all, we can pitch a hissy fit about Russian missiles and buildups in Cuba in the 1960s, why can't the Russians do the same thing with Western military buildups on its borders? So, again, we have to be reasonable here. The Kremlin leader has argued that the Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, whose term expired last year, we're there defending non-democracy, folks, lacks the legitimacy to sign a peace deal. Kiev maintains that elections are impossible to hold amid a war, which of course is nonsense. American President Donald Trump has spoken of the need for the Ukraine to hold an election in comments that echoes Moscow's view. Now, with that, we have the basic hang-up. And I want to get to what I think is really going on in the background here. First of all, I think Mr. Zelensky's days are numbered. One way or the other, he's going to be pushed out of office. What happens to him at that point, I don't know. I wouldn't be a bit surprised to see the Russians make it as part of their initial negotiating platform that Zelensky has to face some sort of international tribunal, which of course is a negotiating point that they'll quickly drop. But in any case, I fully expect Zelensky must go. I don't think that the Russians will negotiate in good faith with that man because they don't think he's capable of negotiating in good faith. But there is, behind all this, in my opinion, a much wider geopolitical and a much more long-term geopolitical game that's afoot. And Mr. Trump has not very successfully articulated that vision. He's hinted around at it, of course, with all of his talk about making Canada a 51st state and having Greenland, either buying Greenland or having it become part of the United States, and so on and so forth. He's hinted at it, but he hasn't really spelled it out. But what it looks like to me is it's finally sinking in, at least to some people in Swampington, D.C., that the unipolar American hegemon order is over. And that means that there has to be a dramatic shift in our geopolitical outlook and strategy on the world stage. We have entered a multipolar world where the great powers are going to be the United States, China, Russia, Japan, India, and eventually, I would suspect, Brazil and or Argentina. In other words, those countries in the world with significant population base, with an adequate or up-to-date technological infrastructure, and with large economies. You'll notice I did not mention any of the European powers nor Europe. Europe is a basket case. They're a long way from being what they were, and I don't see any signs, other than perhaps a few glimmers here and there in France and Germany, that they get it. That wider geopolitics means that Russia, and I'm following an insight of Colonel Douglas McGregor here because I think he's absolutely right. He pointed out that Russia is not simply a European power. It is also, with its projection into the Caucasus, it is a Middle Eastern power. With its former Soviet republics in Central Asia and its border with them, it is also a Central Asian power. With its projection all the way to the Pacific, it is a Pacific power. So it is the one power in the world that has interest and influence in all the regions of the world that we're interested in, and is moreover able to project power into those areas without the need for a sea lift or an airlift to do so. So Russia, in addition to all of that, has yet one more thing that American policymakers need to understand, and that is Russia, like it or not, is still largely of European culture. It is not China, it is not Japan, it is not India. It is still largely a European culture country. And in fact, I would argue it's really the only major power that is not only standing up for that culture, but relatively proud of it and purpose to defend it. So as far as the United States is concerned, we should be making as much common cause with Russia, and where we cannot, we should keep those channels of communications open rather than closed as they have been in the last few years. In fact, really ever since the Maidan coup and revolution back in 2014, when we, the United States and the West, sponsored and led a coup against a democratically elected government. If you don't get that, you're not getting why Russia has been so upset through this whole thing. So in other words, reality, I think, is beginning to set in. I do not think Mr. Putin nor the Russians are going to accept any ceasefire terms without having some concessions from the West, which thus far, and I'm sorry, Mr. Trump, I don't think sanctions and lifting the sanctions are going to be enough of a concession. There's going to have to be agreement in principle on some of those areas that Russia has occupied in the Ukraine, including the Crimea. And there's going to have to be agreement in principle on the Ukraine not becoming part of NATO. Now, whether or not Russia will accede to an American commercial interest in the Ukraine via so-called rare earth minerals agreement, that remains to be seen. My suspicion is no, but the Russians are going to use that proposal as leverage to get their own economic concessions inside the Ukraine, perhaps in conjunction with the United States. So, like it or not, there's going to be something changing in the Ukraine, and I think that change is going to be largely signaled by a change in its government and its policy. Like I say, Zelensky has really managed to piss off pretty much everybody. If you remember his performance at the NATO summit a couple years back when that famous picture circulated, he's standing there with his jumpsuit on amid all the other party goers sipping their champagne and in their formal attire, and he's standing there utterly alone and being ignored. And his performance in the White House didn't help him any. So I suspect Zelensky's days are numbered. There may even be a regime change before all of this takes place. So hold on. We might be approaching the end of this war. I certainly hope so. But I don't think the Russians are going to be... They've played this very well. They've responded. They've said that they're willing to talk, but they've also made it very clear they're not going to simply roll over and accept whatever terms are dictated to them by Mr. Trump. That ain't going to happen. It's much more in America's interest to get this thing wound up than it is in Russia. As I said at the beginning of this, militarily it's all over. The West never was going to win this, and now here we are, and all the media lies have been exposed for what they were. So we'll see where this goes, folks. Don't forget, we have the vid chat tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Don't forget to get your questions and comments in by 10 o'clock U.S. Central Time tonight. And we'll see you, Lord willing, on the flip side. Bye-bye, everybody. God bless.